it's Roz, and I'm really enjoying participating in Victober. And thank you to our hosts, Kate and Katie and Lucy, for organising it again this year. And so I wanted to do a shortish video to participate in the joy of Victober by talking about North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I'm reading in answer to one of the Victober prompts, Katie's in fact, which was to read a Victorian novel in a genre that you enjoy in contemporary fiction, if that makes sense. And North and South is, it's like a social problem novel, you know, it's kind of social, political book of ideas, as well as many other things. And that is something that I certainly enjoy reading in contemporary fiction. So, yes, it is a genre that I enjoy. But it's a book that I read and loved in my teens, so 40 odd years ago. And so another reason for reading this book was, you'll know that I kind of kicked off a reread tag along with Alfred, and Katie, in talking about rereading, said something that stuck in my head ever since. That's Katie Books and Things. She said, how can you say something is a favourite book if you haven't read it relatively recently? And Elizabeth Gaskell was definitely one of my favourite authors when I was a teenager, and I still might refer to her like that, but I haven't read any for 40 years, so how on earth do I know if it's a favourite book? So let's see what I made of it 40 years later. Now, it's a book that looks at class, and that comes up a lot in English fiction, doesn't it? Because we're class-ridden in this country still, but particularly, I guess, that was particularly so in Victorian, or 19th century, 18th and 19th century and 20th century books. You see it again and again, that we're obsessed with class. And this very definitely goes into that. Also the position of women, and industrial unrest, I guess. Yeah, so a lot of interesting themes, but I guess the strongest one is what it says in the title, North and South. So it's almost a novel that explores the tensions and the differences there were particularly in the sort of earlier Victorian times between the south of England, which was historically kind of more prosperous, I guess, but where wealth was still predominantly from landowning. I mean, except in like London, where obviously there's lots of trade and commerce, but the majority of the south, was still landowning, and the majority of working class people in the south, the rural south, worked in agricultural labour, and that was beginning to contrast with the north of England, which was much more actively embracing manufacturing, so mills, factories, and the population was moving from rural areas to work in those factories. The mill hand became a kind of key group in society, and mill owners and their sort of the trade that they were pursuing became a kind of a northern elite of wealth and substance. And yes, the contrast between those two, and in some ways these sort of is fundamental to the book, and one of the nice things, I guess, about Gaskell is she's quite balanced between the two. So she sort of sees strengths in the more sort of the pace of life, perhaps a more humane pace of life in a country village, even though the poor are just as poor, and she doesn't kind of shy away from that, but that it's a more kind of human existence than being at the mercy of machines in a factory. She sees the sort of cultural values, I guess, some of them of the South in terms of education, amongst the upper classes, that is, as something of value. Although she is scathing, I think, about their sort of the way they look down on trade and so on. So, and she sees them as old-fashioned and kind of stick in the mud compared with the North, compared with the energy and innovation that she depicts there in yes, embracing new technology, steam technology, and making things happen with a vigour that she values. So there's a kind of like but equally recognising that came at the expense of the experience of living in very unhealthy cities and working in very yes, quite unhealthy conditions in those factories, particularly the cotton mills she's looking at here. So she has a nice balance between the two, and that is the I suppose the kind of political side of the book. And she conveys that through her central character, Margaret Hale, who is the daughter of a country parson, who's not well off, but has that kind of upper class background and education, you know, this kind of public school classics kind of education. And Margaret lives a lot of her childhood with her, or teens, with her rich aunt and cousin, who, and with them as part of a kind of a London society that wouldn't dream of mixing with someone whose fortune came from trade. And would sneer at them. And then Margaret, through a set of circumstances, moves with her family, her parents, to the north of England, to the town of Milton that is based on Manchester, and comes into contact with mill owners and mill workers, and her kind of ideas are expanded through that. That makes it sound a very serious book, and actually this is very much a love story as well, and it's kind of like a rewriting, I suppose, of the Pride and Prejudice story. You know, that thing of two people who almost fall in love despite themselves and have kind of prejudices about each other and don't get together because of their pride. Yeah, it's a retelling of that in many ways. So, how did it stand up to a rereading after 40 years? Now, I was worried at the beginning. The first few chapters I found a bit odd and insipid, I suppose. She's scene setting and introducing us to Margaret and her circumstances. And later on in the book, as I look back, I understood what she'd been doing in those initial chapters. But I'd be interested. I know when she wrote the book, it was initially serialised in Dickens's weekly magazine, Household Words, kind of across 1854, and then it was published as a book with some revisions in 1855. And I think it reminds us how more patient Victorian readers were in a book kind of getting off the ground. You know, we you know, I hear people say, oh, and if it doesn't grab me in the first, you know, chapter or the first 30 pages, then, you know, I'm not going to stick with it. They didn't expect to be grabbed. They were willing to let things evolve, I suppose. Having said that, if you read Jane Austen, she does grab you in that first chapter, so it's also a kind of stylistic choice, I suppose, about pace. But once I got beyond the first few chapters and got caught up in Margaret's story, I loved this book. There are some quite shocking bits in a way. You could talk about the poverty and so on, and that's shocking. But one of the most shocking bits was about the relationship of her parents, and you know, her father makes this huge life-changing decision that means they're going to have to give up their home and move to the north, and he doesn't tell his wife until 2 weeks before they're going to move. it really reminds you about how powerless Victorian wives were. And Margaret, I think Elizabeth Gaskell was obviously a strong-minded woman, and she writes in Margaret a strong woman character who is determined to carve out her own life and not just kind of fall into marriage as a way of surviving. But then she is lucky that she does end up with a legacy that kind of gives her that, ultimately will give her that independence, and means she can make a more considered choice when she decides that she is going to join her life with someone. And I won't say who, because who I wouldn't want to spoil. I wouldn't want to spoil this lovely novel for you if you read it. So all of that, really enjoyable, and I did love it as I loved it when I read it at age 14 or whatever. Would I still say that Elizabeth Gaskell is absolutely one of my favourite authors? I think possibly not. She writes really well, but she doesn't have quite the kind of poetic intensity of Hardy or Charlotte Bronte or Emily Bronte, even though Wuthering Heights is not one of my favourite books. You know, that there's a sort of an emotional and intensity in that book. Yeah, and a kind of a beauty of writing in something like Jane Eyre that it's in it holds me more. She's a little bit, now I've got to think how to put this without, she's a slightly pious writer. Now I don't mean in a religious sense. As it happens, she is the wife, Elizabeth Gaskell was the wife of a Unitarian minister, so her religion, which was a sort of dissenting faith, obviously was important to her, but I don't mean that. What I mean is she's a bit kind of po-faced and serious. I think what this lacked for me that you would find in Dickens or particularly in George Eliot, I'd say is a kind of an element of humour and of perhaps kind of fondly and respectfully, nevertheless laughing at human habits, human characteristics, that I would have enjoyed a little bit of that in this book. Having said that, wonderful book, and I will definitely now reread more Elizabeth Gaskell. And I remember that my kind of least favourite of the books of hers that I read when I read them in my teens was Cranford. I think because I was looking for the love story perhaps that you get in North and South or Mary Barton or Wives and Daughters. And it's not in Cranford, but what Cranford has is that humour, so I should be very interested to go back and read that. Do tell me about your appreciation or understanding of North and South and Elizabeth Gaskell in general. I would love to have a bit of a discussion about that.